Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, Carolyn and the museum, for inviting me here to talk to you this afternoon. And thank you all for coming out on a beautiful day when you have lots of other options of things to do. So I'm going to break this presentation down into 3 parts, so you'll kind of know where we're at throughout it. The first is I'm going to talk about who Railroad Jack was, because unless you've heard me talk about him before, there's a very good chance you've never heard of him. And if you have, I would love to talk to you and find out where you found out. The second is what Carolyn alluded to. I'm going to talk about how and why I have tried to solve the mystery of his missing body. It's not as grim as it sounds, but it is almost Halloween, so indulge me a little bit of taxidermy talk. And then I'm going to wrap up talking about why Jack and famous dogs even matter. I'm hoping that since you've already volunteered your time and interest to be here, it won't be too hard of a sell. But I will end up putting it in a little bit of context to explain why I think it's important. So, who was Railroad Jack? This is Railroad Jack. Railroad Jack lived a full and eventful life before his death from old age in 1893. He traveled across America into Cuba and Mexico. He was kidnapped, he was forced into a sideshow, he was stabbed, and he was locked into a professional rivalry, which is pretty impressive for a dog. In many ways, Jack and other famous dogs represented 19th century aspirations with their rags to riches stories of achieving a canine version of the American dream. I know that sounds very lofty, but stay with me. Now, Jack's Dickensian origin stories began in Albany around 1880. Now, forgive the quality of this. This is from a newspaper in Albany. This is actually the first ever mention of Railroad Jack that I've been able to find. You can see there was some artistic license taken with his image. The majority of my research actually has been drawn from newspapers and periodicals. That is where the surviving text largely is that tells of his travels. And actually the documentation is really extensive within this. Now, the details of Jack's early days are difficult to ascertain. At some point in the early 1880s, he becomes the mascot of the baggage room of the Union Depot in Albany. Now, he then at some point starts riding trains. The how is a little murky. A lot of people talk about how it was just this innate thing that he started to do, and he had this love for the rails. Likely someone started bringing him on, but we can, go with what the good story is here for a second. Now, accounts of his origins and whereabouts, as I said, are spotty for the first few years, and many are written retroactively at the end of his life. So we have to take, a whole heaping shovel full of salt with some of these accounts. I say that, though, everything is well documented, and I will let you know if there are times where I think the myth is really happening versus where I know he actually was. So one of the things that becomes a bit mythic is he was allegedly at the inauguration of Grover Cleveland in Washington, D.C. in March of 1885. I found no record of that actually happening from the time, but it's something that becomes a bit aggrandized at the end of his life. And giving his legacy a little bit more of a flourish. Now, newspapers didn't begin regularly reporting on Jack until 1888, so that is a little bit of a gap. And by that point, Railroad Jack had begun taking longer trips, particularly across New York State, but really into other parts of the country, outward to Chicago quite a bit, and then did make some West Coast trips, and has hit the majority of the country by the end of his life. The Brookfield, New York Courier commented that Jack put himself in as, quote, Chief Railroad Inspector of the United States, to give you a little indication of the extent of his travels. And it's in these reports that more of his story begins to be added or embellished. It's important to note that Jack's start really is as a pet of the railroad workers, particularly the baggage men, so the men who were in carrying and transferring everyone's bags on the train. These men were often immigrants, mostly from Ireland, and there was a lot of solidarity that they felt with Jack and was discussed relatively openly. Jack was a mutt, possibly a stray, though that's debatable. He likely was the pet of somebody associated with the station, but the stray narrative was a little more attractive, I think, for people. These men provided a lot of care for Jack, and it was a big deal if Jack came into your station. Railroad work was incredibly dangerous during this time, and if you dig into those stories, it is just horror after horror of railroad accidents, both when the train is moving and in the station. It was very dangerous. The pay and conditions were also very bad, and men could face significant retaliation for participating in labor movements. For example, Matt McCarthy, who was the baggage master in Albany during Jack's tenure there and was Jack's primary caregiver, at one point was reassigned to another less desirable station as punishment, essentially, for his part in a strike that had happened. He ultimately makes it back, but their life can be relatively unstable in this time. So having Jack around was a really great outlet for that stress, and he provided some levity and something external for them to care for. So in the travel between stations, word of mouth begins to grow, and so does his reputation. His comings and goings were first reported in the railroad news sections of the newspapers. So if you're familiar with 19th century newspapers, there's also a lot of gossip published in them. They are my favorite source just for that fact, because they function relatively differently than newspapers do today. So there were a lot of very short items to say Railroad Jack came here, and it's just one line. So he starts to move out of those niche sections of the newspaper, and reporters start to do stories on him and start to track him down. And you can see how it organically starts to grow and how his popularity increases through the media as he travels. And as Jack appeared in more towns and in more newspapers, the demand for him to make scheduled public appearances grew too. In 1889, the Albany Kennel Club wanted Jack to make an appearance at their annual exhibition, but they had to send to Binghamton to get him because that's where he was at the time. He did not necessarily follow anyone else's schedules, so he could be a little hard to track down. His increased travels required him to have more identification. The railroad men gave him his own collar and tags so that people knew this just wasn't any regular old stray, because that could be very dangerous in this era too. You have to keep in mind this is an era where people are very, very afraid of rabies. So stray dogs are not something that is very welcomed. Again, apologies for this. I'll explain what this is in a second. The quality, not very high. But Jack's became a well-known figure in a lot of areas, with newspaper editors, photographers, really clamoring for the chance to have him come into their studios. So as such, his image becomes something that can sell things. So this image here is from a newspaper, and it is an ad for Albany's Thomas Ritchie & Co. shoe store. And they featured Railroad Jack's image on their advertising and on the boxes of their shoes. And their ad claims, Jack can tell by a man's look whether he wears Thomas Ritchie & Co. Hamburg Cordovan cork sole shoes or not. Jack says no matter where he wanders, he will find them. When he sees anyone cold or crippled, he will call out. So not only is that a great example of just sort of crass capitalism here, using his image, it also, in just a couple of sentences, is doing a lot of myth building about the character of Railroad Jack, that he is this dog of the people, essentially, and of the disabled and the working classes. So this is one of my favorite little Railroad Jack side stories. And they continued to sell these after he died, and actually kind of used his death as also additional marketing. Now, on the top of the advertisements, entertaining Jack became sort of its own competition, and people developed special experiences for this distinguished canine. For example, on one trip to Saratoga, he was brought to the casino and given a ride on the merry-go-round. So there was always a little bit of a competition to see who could come up with the best opportunities for Jack. During an 1890 visit to Elmira, which Carolyn mentioned at the beginning, I lived in Elmira for over 5 years, and I did some work on this dog here. Jack was brought to the county fairgrounds where the interstate fair was being held, and he had a play date with this dog right here, whose name was Colonel. Colonel was the St. Bernard mascot of the Elmira Telegram, one of the major newspapers in that region. And I just bring this up because, first of all, I love Colonel also, and it's a great image. But when I had found that these two dogs, I had worked on both of them, like met, and it was a thing. It was just a very exciting moment for me. But despite Jack's celebrity status, or even someone like Colonel, life was still very dangerous for a dog in the 19th century. Specifically if they were riding on trains. Now, train travel in this time was also dangerous for people, but Jack had several troubles on the rails. First of all, in 1890, he was riding in the baggage cars, which is where he also tended to ride. He was not riding in the passenger cars. And a full coffin fell on him and amputated one of his toes. In April 1890, he had a bad year in 1890. He jumped from a moving train that was going 25 miles an hour near Stony Point, New York, and badly injured his foot and was taken to the hospital. Unclear if it was a human hospital or an animal hospital. They just used hospital. But in that time, it honestly kind of could have been either, given who he was. Then, in 1890, also, he was stabbed in the chest during a break-in at the Union Station. Now, he was reportedly near death, but somehow made a miraculous recovery and was back in a couple of weeks riding trains again. And the trainmen would joke that if you would ask him, he would roll over and show you his scar. Later that August, in that same year, he falls off a train again when it rounded a corner near Fultonville, a little bit to the north, and bruised and cut his chest. But again, seemingly an indestructible dog, and was back at it. Now, when I talk about Jack, I like to bring in a local example, and it's normally very easy because he traveled so extensively through New York. And this is really no different. So while I have no record that he was ever in Prattsville, he was very close by. In the summer of 1891, Jack took a Catskills vacation, coming in on the Ulster and Delaware train, and in Phoenicia transferring to the Stony Clove and Catskill Mountain line, winding his way north to the Hotel Catterskill. Now, the Hotel Catterskill opened 10 years before Jack came, and I'm assuming everyone knows where this was, up in the Hunter area, right? Okay, out by Catterskill Falls. After the additions put on the hotel, they could have over 1,000 guests staying there, basking in the mountain splendor. So Jack spent the night at the Hotel Catterskill, probably in an outbuilding, but the records are unclear. He had several hotels, particularly one in Albany called the Hotel Delavan, where he was a regular, but he was more of a regular in the kitchens than in the rooms. So probably they didn't give him a suite. So the report of his trip to the Hotel Catterskill said that he, quote, barked with delight at the beautiful scenery. And it was quite a view. It was very high up there. After packing his bags from the Hotel Catterskill, he then went to Pine Hill, where he, quote, scraped an acquaintance with the summer boarders there. So really, it's very easy in New York State to find places that Jack was. So in 1890 is also when Jack's chroniclers add a rival to the mix. Now, this is the Postal Service's Owney, also a train-riding dog who rode in the mail cars and took up his residence mainly at the post office in Albany. But then, like Jack would go to train stations around the country, Owney would go and stay at post offices around the country. But the train riding is the commonality. Owney, at first, was portrayed as the new upstart rival, and this was dramatized in the press. Owney was said to be jealous of Jack, and that the mere mention of Jack's name made Owney howl. Again, a lot of salt here. But what's ironic is while some of the newspapers were exploiting this rivalry, others couldn't tell them apart. And as you can see, they did look really pretty similar. They are both terrier mutts. I can tell them apart, but I've stared at them for hours. The main tell is Jack's ears were cropped. So their faces look a little bit different, but they were very similar. They were similar size, similar color. It's really remarkable that two nearly identical dogs come out of Albany at the same time. And you can understand how people would be confused. There would also be reports sometimes where people thought they were the same. So you'll see things like Railroad Jack, who goes by Owney amongst his friends. So when they came on the scene, people had some trouble working with this. The larger book project that I'm working on really is a dual biography of Owney and Railroad Jack. I've chosen to focus on Railroad Jack here. But if anyone does have questions about Owney at the end, I'm also happy to talk extensively about him. He is the better known one today. His body is taxidermied at the National Postal Museum in Washington, D.C. He has been on his own stamp in 2011. There are multiple children's books about him. So, I mean, not a household name necessarily for everyone, but definitely has name recognition today. So you can see his ears here. You can see he's different. By 1891, people began to note that Jack, who at this time was around 10 years old, was starting to slow down. Still, Jack maintained a busy travel schedule, and around late August or early September of 1891, Jack goes missing. Now, it's not necessarily strange for him to be missing for a little bit of time during this period. You have to figure no one's getting on the phone and saying, oh, Jack's arrived, so sometimes the news is a little bit delayed, or you might get a telegram, but then by that time he's moved on. So it's not abnormal to lose track of him for a little while, but he begins to become gone for an alarming amount of time. So there's rumors that he died around Buffalo, so the train men start to mourn him. However, they then get a press clipping of an advertisement that says that he is in a dime museum in Buffalo. So Railroad Jack, depending on who you believe, went voluntarily or was dog-napped into the Musée Theater in Buffalo, which was run by a man named Marvin Robinson. And Robinson was kind of like a P.T. Barnum light, if you can imagine, and has a very large building in Buffalo where he has everything from a wax museum to a chamber of horrors and taxidermy. There's a full theater. It's really a production. And he has a smaller theater where he has more of the kind of freak show acts. And Railroad Jack was placed amongst that. So Railroad Jack in the advertisement was placed on display along, quote, a Chinese Lilliputian, a giantess, and a petrified woman. And the show had a 10-cent admission fee. And there were 4 showings a day. So you had lots of opportunity to get up close with Railroad Jack. And this again shows that a showman recognized people knew who this was, and they would come pay to see the strange traveling dog. The show also went to Rochester, where Robinson had another branch of his musée. The railroad men, on the other hand, were not happy that their dog was being held hostage as they saw it, and they organized to get Jack back, ultimately even sending some of them to Buffalo to have a confrontation if needed. It wasn't needed. He went back to riding trains, and actually Marvin Robinson argued that the dog had kind of showed up and was happier just hanging out all day, sitting around, than he was riding the rails. But again, it's all who you choose to believe. But he ends up back on the road by the end of the year. Oh, here's Robinson. And then this is the larger theater, so this is not where Jack was, but you can get a little glimpse of the scale. This was a huge building. Jack traveled throughout 1892, even though he was becoming more decrepit. That summer, he traveled the furthest, really, that he had ever traveled before, making a full cross-country trip from Maine down the East Coast over to California, into Mexico, and throughout the West, also taking a boat to Cuba. During a stopover in Salt Lake City, Utah, he was laid up for a bit after, quote, one of his propellers was chawed upon by a Mormon dog. When he arrived in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Herald inspected him and weighed him, noting that his weight was at 53 pounds. Now, this is a dog that stood about 18 inches tall, so that is not a healthy weight for him. They also inventoried that he had 44 tags that had been given to him at various stops. People love to give him gifts. This is also a thing with Owney. Particularly personalized tags saying, you know, that he was in a certain town on a certain date. Jack, however, got even weirder stuff than Owney. So when he comes back to Albany from this trip, he has boxes of tokens along with him, including a bunch of unusual things like a human skull, medicines for cramps, rheumatism, consumption, cholera, dysentery, sunstroke, and kidney troubles, a full set of false teeth, and a mammoth female shoe labeled Compliments of the Belle of Chicago. And I think I have another photo with that one coming up. If not, it was the first image that I had also. So Jack likely made a few more small regional trips in the beginning of 1893, but his weight and age really became a burden. On June 13th, 1893, at approximately the age of 13, he died peacefully in the baggage room of the Union Station, surrounded by the staff. Newspapers across the country ran mournful obituaries, and the railroad men commissioned a taxidermist to have him stuffed so he could be put on display. And that brings us to the central mystery and the second part that I promised. What happened to Railroad Jack's body? So in December of 1894, Jack's body was on display at Saul's clothing store on North Pearl Street in Albany. This was a display of taxidermy, a temporary thing. He was in amongst deer and all manner of more traditional taxidermy. And for years, that was my last known sighting of where his body was. I tried to find out what happened to the contents of Saul's store, but that was a little bit fruitless because, like I said, it was a temporary exhibition. I then had a little bit more of a breakthrough, and I found a newspaper article mentioning he was back in the home of the taxidermist, a man named William Viggers. This was in 1897, I believe, so 4 years after Jack died. His body was still around. And that he was in a room amongst other taxidermy that Viggers had done in his home. And at least a portion of Jack's medals and gifts were also on display with him there. Then after that, he disappears. And I wish it was in some kind of dramatic fashion, like a heist or something to that effect, because then maybe there would be a paper trail, but there isn't. I've tried to track down, assuming if Viggers was the last person who had him, I've tried to track down generations to see if maybe these things were passed down. Viggers died in 1911 and had 5 sons and 11 grandchildren. Some of them also went into the taxidermy business, but the trail does sort of go cold after that. I've not been able to find anyone with a very direct connection to this family after that generation. I'm still working to see if there are probate records that give any indication of the contents of his house when he died. But you do, at certain points, as a historian, find yourself in a very weird position of wondering if you should contact some historical figure's distant relatives to see if they have any taxidermy dog corpses handed down through the generations. It's a weird cold call. So that also is the possibility that Jack's body was brought back to the Union Depot for display, which was the original idea, is that he would be amongst the trainmen in the station. That also gets complicated. In 1898, the city of Albany approved the construction of a new Union station. So Jack's home base is torn down just a couple of years after his death, and a new station is opened in 1900, just a little bit down the street. So was it moved to the new location? There's no record of that. Was it taken by a railroad worker? No reports to confirm what happens. So how does one of the most famous dogs of this era, how does their body go missing? Like, how do you lose a celebrity dog corpse? And this has vexed me for years. And it seems an indignity, right, to be so easily forgotten and so quickly. I've contacted the Albany museums and Albany independent historians, asking about their collections, asking to see if they have any leads. Everyone has been lovely, but no one has had really any information that furthers the search. I've scoured the newspapers extensively, and just nothing comes up. I've tried to think of alternates of what could have happened. For example, there was a dog in Ohio who was a World War I dog named Bing, and he was taxidermied at first and then later buried. So I've looked into pet cemeteries to see if there was a possibility that something similar could have happened to Railroad Jack. In October of 2017, and it gives you some indication of how long I've been working on this, because this was not a new project in 2017. It's been probably a little over a decade at this point. I turned to the internet, figuring people love dogs, people love mysteries, people love finding things, hoping like, hey, maybe this will go viral. It didn't go viral, but I did gain some modest attention. A lot of people contacting me with support and interest and telling me that they would keep their eyes open for dog taxidermy when they went to flea markets, which is a really interesting network of people to build, and I'm grateful for them. I was interviewed for a story in the Albany Times-Union in 2018, in which I laid out my desires to try to find him, and reading it back, I had given this quote. I feel like if there are any clues left, they're probably in someone's personal collection, private family papers or something. I'm not thinking Jack's stuffed corpse is in somebody's attic, but who knows? With a plea like that, how could someone not come forward? Again, nothing really happened, but this network continued to grow. So, unfortunately, I don't have a resolution. I hope you weren't sitting here this whole time thinking I was going to drop a huge reveal on you. I don't know what happened to him. I'm still open to the possibility that evidence will come forward when I allow myself to be optimistic. But realistically, I imagine that he has been long lost. Mostly based just on the nature of 19th century taxidermy. If you know anything about the chemicals and processes, it wasn't necessarily a stable medium. Also, I did have someone come forward to talk to me about research they had done on vigors, who was maybe more of an amateur taxidermist when he took the Railroad Jack commission. So there had been some issues in that taxidermy process. So he might not have been done to the most professional standards anyway. So my guess is he got moth-eaten or water damaged or just kind of gross over time and was probably disposed of with someone not even realizing what they had. However, there is one more mystery that's likely to be a little easier to solve, and that's this. There is an oil painting of Railroad Jack that is also missing. And this was last known to be in Farnham's restaurant in Albany in the 1960s, so a much more recent than the 1890s. That restaurant closed down. My assumption is that this is in someone's home or has been in someone's home. So if you are ever at a dinner party and see this, please let me know. I'm very interested in the location of that painting. So I'm going to wrap up with the why. Why does this matter? Why have I talked to you for 40-ish minutes on these old dead dogs? So why focus on Jack to start with? Jack, as I've mentioned, was not the only famous dog of the late 19th century. He wasn't even technically the first. He was one of several train riding dogs, including Owney. But I still think that train dogs, and Jack in particular, are the most compelling examples of the rise of canine celebrity because their mobility allowed them to achieve a wider celebrity than the average dog. Before Jack comes onto the scene, it wouldn't be uncommon, say, in your community to have a dog that everyone recognized. Like, oh, that's the butcher's dog who does this, and everyone knows of them. But nobody outside of your town is really going to have any awareness of that. So their train riding allows basically that same concept of like, oh, here's a unique dog doing a weird thing, to spread really throughout. Jack's fame is also really notable because he is coming in right at the time where there is a huge new emphasis on purebred dogs. This is right at the time that the Westminster Kennel Club show starts. Really, the breed standards that we think of now for dog showing are being codified at this time. So there's a move away from the mutt. And Jack is just a textbook mutt. No one knows where he comes from. He is a terrier of really just indistinguishable origins. So his muttness becomes really a symbol for a lot of people. Like I said, he's really in with the working class, the immigrants, and they see themselves in him, right? That they're the mutts too, right? They are really in solidarity with him. This is also a time when views of animals are just changing in general. As my former graduate advisor, Catherine Greer, writes in her book, Pets in America, the 19th century is where we really develop our concept of pet keeping as we know it now. And Jack's story is reflective of that. Now, most importantly, I think that the study of animal fame gives us a really unique window into our understanding of the Gilded Age. I've joked that Railroad Jack and Owney are kind of like the Forrest Gumps of their era, because they have this amazing ability to just be intertwined with pretty much every important thing that's happening in that era. They were used as symbols of the labor movement frequently. I didn't even get into some of the strikes and ways that they were discussed during that. They tell us about the rapidly expanding transportation and communication systems of the era. They met famous people and politicians, not Grover Cleveland, but they met others. And they straddled the line of high and low culture and of the upper and working classes in a way that most humans couldn't. They tell us about health and public services. They're a window into masculinity and changing gender roles. They talk about capitalism and consumer culture, about entertainment, and so much more. And researching them has really taken me into more corners of the Gilded Age than any other project that I've done before. So I know it might seem a little silly on the surface to spend this much time and energy talking about dogs, but it really is, I think, one of the best encapsulations of what was happening in that era through this tiny fuzzy lens. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. I've got my information up here if you would like to contact me, and I'm happy to take questions if anyone has them.
Would some of the signs travel with him certain places?
So largely not. Really, once he had developed a reputation, the railroad men kind of knew who he was. And you would have both the employees who were in the stations and the ones on the train. So he didn't necessarily have a designated handler, but people tended to have eyes on him throughout and knew to look out for him. Now, Railroad Jack and Owney didn't have that, but Colonel, the St. Bernard that I mentioned before, the newspaper actually hired a boy to travel with Colonel. So they were sort of this, oh, hello. There's a wasp. They were this traveling duo. So there are some examples of that, but not so much with Railroad Jack and Owney.
How would he have gotten to Cuba?
Yes. So from Florida, there was a boat that ran. So he didn't obviously choose to transfer from the boat to Cuba, but he was placed on the boat to transfer down to Cuba.
Okay.
Yeah, so primarily train travel, but that is one of the 2 or 3 times I've documented that he was on a boat. He also took a steamship ride on Lake George, I believe, at one point. So mostly trains. And it's great because I have a basically train schedule for the whole country from that year. And you can pinpoint exactly when he would have arrived based on when the boats ran. So the newspaper articles are a little bit vague as to the whole time, but he was only there, I want to say, for maybe like 10 hours or so. It was a quick turnaround. I think they mostly sent him just so they could say he went. Yeah. Anything else?
I have one more.
He was
Did
just-
you ever, I'm sorry,
No.
did you ever look for like the old shoe boxes like he would have been advertised on, or any memorabilia from
Yeah.
that he would have been part of?
I have looked. I have not come up with any of them, unfortunately. I have eBay alerts set. That's one of the primary things. I do searches. I found the, let me go back to, this is a cabinet card that I won in an auction. This was an advertisement, actually, that was put out right after his death by a patent medicine company in Massachusetts. And you can see that, I don't want to step on the wasp here, but there's a liniment box that has been 19th century photoshopped in. He was not actually posed next to it. You can see the cut and paste here if you look closely. And that giant shoe that he got is actually what's posed with him on the other side there. So things occasionally do come up with Railroad Jack. So that image, there are very few photos of Railroad Jack. This is actually one that I lost in an auction. Devastating. And then there's one other photo I didn't share, but was a woman, I want to say whose family was from the Kingston area and had a photo of him in their family collection. So it's another cabinet card that she did share with me, but I didn't want to make public because I don't actually own the rights to it. But hopefully when the book is published, we can get permission. So there are 3 known photographs of Railroad Jack at this point.
And he basically just came and he wanted.
Yeah, so largely he would just kind of wander. He would there were circuits that he would make, particularly if he knew that there was somebody friendly or a good meal often that he could find. So, there are between, for example, Albany and New York City to Binghamton, even out to Elmira and Buffalo. He would kind of make that loop a lot, and would travel some different lines than Owney did. So, for example, in Elmira, when the whole rivalry went down, the Elmira papers were like, well, we don't care about Owney. Like, Jack is the one who comes here. Like, we love Jack. Forget about this other guy. So they would hit up slightly different locations. But yeah, there was a lot of just kind of independent travel, but also human intervention, particularly when it was something like, oh, he needs to be at this dog show, or he needs to be at this. Owney, for example, Owney lives until 1897, so he lives a few years after Railroad Jack. And in that period, Owney is brought to multiple fundraisers for mutual benefit associations for railroad workers. So he is very actively used in labor fundraising. And then those were times where obviously he was tracked down. There's a story about the Columbian Expo, 1893, the Columbian anniversary. There's a parade in Albany where they built a special float for Railroad Jack to be on. And they had to actually lock him into the station to make sure that he was going to be there to get on the float, to be on the parade. So human intervention was required sometimes.